Um, in our current status quo, we see people already suffering from rising sea levels and impacts of climate change having significant effects on their health, whilst governments around the world are still prioritizing supposedly economic growth. The issue with this is that the health of these citizens, which is essential towards economic progression, is being sacrificed for the supposed economic growth, which is entirely unintuitive and immoral. Under all costs, we propose that the government seeks to achieve net zero as soon as possible, even if there are some short-term economic impacts. We identify key stakeholders being people already getting affected by climate change, people who are about to get impacted by climate change, the governments, and the environment. Okay, on to my first point now on how the damages towards environment are irreversible. Each year, billions of tons of carbon dioxide are being released into the atmosphere, affecting stakeholders, being the environment, the quality of life, or economic growth. We are also obliged to help more vulnerable stakeholders in what way we can. So, citizens should be lost. In essence, no amount of money can possibly restore the environment if we were unable to further economic losses. It is unintuitive why anyone would possibly desire to improve the land, which is going to fall apart inevitably, and to divert even more resources into it. Okay, maybe you will supposedly prepare this land for the ensuing disaster. Yet economic growth simply cannot buy the environment. You simply are making the infrastructure and agriculture larger in impact, while opposition have done nothing towards improving the environment. We see that while certain industries may supposedly experience short-term growth, like fossil fuels or carbon-intensive sectors, the economic damage would disproportionately outweigh these short-term gains. We see a single major event translating into billions of dollars. Our priorities should not be trying to improve the industry, which will ultimately be destroyed if we do not try to prevent further events like this happening through maybe the attempts to stop climate change are less successful than anticipated, but at least we are doing what is morally correct. We are attempting to save lives, save money in the long term, save the environment, as compared to unintuitively trying to save all these things with this untimely economic growth. Therefore, you should weigh us particularly highly, and I'm proud to propose.
There are ways to face climate change without trading off the economic growth and continued innovation. In a world that values workers' rights to fair pay, very proud to oppose. What economic sectors is the government's policy likely to target? Two notes on set up here. We would firstly posit that companies that produce the most carbon emissions are from mining sectors, from sectors like the mining industry, the goods production industry, thanks factories, power plants, or fracking. But secondly, industries where white-collar or educated workers are unlikely to be impacted much by this policy because their work is much more theoretical and knowledge-based. Think jobs like doctor, lawyer, coder, or accountant. And second note on setup then, what is this policy likely to look like? We think that government has to defend a strong policy against environmental damage, including heavy sin tasks and a strong reduction of carbon emissions that companies are able to emit without facing heavy fines. Gov must concede that many companies would go bankrupt or face heavy economic harms. Further, we would posit that this policy is likely to disproportionately affect workers. Companies are likely to lay off their workers if their total production ability is cut, and the richer owners of these companies have disproportionate power over their workers and are therefore likely to abuse their power, so they are able to quickly exit carbon-heavy industries without a single penny lost. First argument then about stopping climate change. Firstly, some mitigation efforts help the economy. Two key examples to illustrate this point. Firstly, on renewable energy. Efforts to mitigate climate change, such as renewable energy, have actually developed so much they are cheaper to operate compared to traditional energy sources such as fossil fuel plants. This is because it is evident, as fossil fuels have become increasingly rare, that the prices of oil, coal, and gas increase at a quickened rate. Note, sources such as solar and wind energy are always cheaper to maintain, so they don't require a fuel source compared to fossil fuel plants. So the prices start creating them is marginally cheaper to run renewables in status quo. Then secondly, on EVs, the same applies to EVs and other more sustainable forms of transportation, which takes advantage of the affordability of new developments in sustainable tech and are becoming increasingly cheaper to maintain. The conclusion is that mitigation efforts don't necessarily have to be at the cost cost of economic growth, like proposition would have you believe. We should instead opt into investing into an economically beneficial climate change mitigation because this is a choice. But secondly, even past these measures, mitigation is less feasible than adaptation. This is true because the source of carbon is not only companies and factories. This includes cars, this includes household emissions, includes agriculture emissions. To the extent that Gov does not have the fiat to destroy these things, we would argue that the impact Gov has on stopping climate change is extremely marginal. But further, we would posit that even if we cut all of these emissions, climate change will happen, albeit slower. There is no way to know if stopping climate change is even feasible, and it is likely that finding a viable solution would take years or decades and even more money. Instead, we would posit that a better method of dealing with climate change is a focus on adaptation. To engage with Prop's biggest push, adaptation has the added benefit of helping vulnerable people, like helping people from disappearing islands and areas hit most by flooding and wildfires with the rescue and relocation teams. We think that this core idea of mitigation is that it helps people around the globe equally. Do not let Prop mischaracterize their own policy. But this applies to a worst case scenario where economic development and stopping climate change is a trade-off, as it is assured that adaptation measures will work. Second argument then about protecting vulnerable workers. The premise here is that imposing strict environmental regulations would only harm the most vulnerable workers whose jobs can be easily replaced by proposition. Why are these workers harmed on Gov? We would posit that the industries impacted most severely are industries with laborers. It's likely that power plants, factories, coal miners, and other job industries will be harmed. For example, governments would probably demand major carbon taxes on these corporations. As a result, these companies would inevitably cut off their wages for their workers. That impacts the people that are working that very job sectors. Essentially, these workers lose their job. But why is this especially significant? It is unfair to target these vulnerable people because they have no way to get other jobs. The skill sets that they can use in these industries cannot be applied to other occupations. This is to say, the skills used replaced by technology are rarely transferable to other fields, so these workers are only left with limited alternative options to maintain their lives. But further, note that these individuals and families are already living from paycheck to paycheck, and doing tiresome labor at these coal mines is the only way for them to make the bare minimum of income necessary to sustain their basic livelihoods. The sudden influx of unemployed individuals would heavily strain government and community institutions like welfare and support systems. This overburdening on services would only be counterproductive to governments in several aspects. The conclusion made here is that it's not worth saving the environment for the impact of most vulnerable stakeholders, also for further harms done to the government. But the comparative here is that, of course, some more vulnerable stakeholders are impacted by climate change, but we have adaptation methods like provided in first argument. Therefore, at the end of my speech, you should believe that losing a source of stable income is the most detrimental effect on these workers. Very proud to oppose.
Seems like to do this debate, first and some rebuttal, and then on my substantive. So the key thing the opposition has fatally realized is that they base their arguments all on how our road provides a lot of harm to these mining factory workers. We agree with all of this, but this is not mutually exclusive. The harm also exists in the other road, because according to the model or the solution against ours, they'll use renewable energy to help fight it. So what does this mean when they are going to use renewable energy? This means that because they also say the many benefit from it, they say it's cheaper, it's more likely to be like a better alternative. So that means we see that most likely more people are more likely to use these renewable energy. So what does this mean? This means that these coal factories, these fossil fuels, they're not going to get used. So this means that these mining industry workers, the opposition says, that are going to get affected severely in our road, will get more affected severely in their road. Because at least in our road, these workers aren't going to get as badly affected. They're going to get at least some paycheck. And the opposition themselves has also said how these workers aren't able to work anywhere else. So what does this mean? This means that all the harms that are on that they say on us will probably convert all the way. All of them will probably convert to their side. And I would just like to prove why that is. Firstly, because renewable energy is a new form of energy, which is trying a solution to solve it, and that opposition recommends. That opposition says is good, and opposition says is a better solution than actually spending a lot of money on trying to stop climate change. So in their scenario, it's just worse altogether, because first of all, they've got that terrible harm also on them. Well, our harm of these workers being unable to be paid as much, it's much less than not getting paid at all and not being able to transfer their work skills to anything else. Second of all, they also said that we cannot stop climate change at all completely. However, I like to say that it is true that we may not be able to stop climate change completely. However, we are able to mitigate the effects, and this is one of the first steps to helping in economic growth. Because first of all, climate change is a really bad thing, And because why is that the case? This is because it's like it burdens the like environment. Not only that, it burdens like the road. And if we can't stop climate change, economic growth is actually not possible. So why is this the case? Two mechanisms to why it's not to know two mechanisms to why it's impossible. Because first of all, climate change like severely affects people's health, and as stated by the first speaker, and this shows like these workers may not be able to maintain these factories, etc. They might not have the necessary abilities or skills. Second mechanism is how these factories uh if they're just gonna produce more pollution and more, then it's like they're not really gonna achieve anything from it, and eventually they'll be like cut down from like under the pressure, like from like the fines, etc. So, however, opposition has stated this. However, in our road, although they do get fined, that's only for a short term. In their long term, these like people, they're climate because that's only for a short term. In their road, there's gonna be like a long term harm where like these factories are just gonna be continually like harmed because they're just producing more and more pollution. And what does this mean? This means that like the environment is getting pushed down. And I would just like to point out that opposition has not replied to anything about how environment is irreversible and how like economic growth is actually reversible. Because the most important thing in this debate is how environment is irreversible. Once we make it like go on, they themselves said that we cannot like basically reverse it. So this shows how important environment is actually compared to economic growth. Where economic growth can like be achieved again, environment cannot. So therefore, I hope to prove to you that why the government should strongly prioritize stopping climate change. Therefore, I'm proud to propose. Thank you.
One step forward, three steps back. This is proposition's stance when governments invest precious resources into a cause that has low feasibility from the very beginning. So proud to oppose. I want to start with some responses then. I think the main thing that government tries to push is that the harms on our side are only short-term, therefore they're able to gain all the benefits. This is inherently untrue and uncharitable, right? Gov tries to gain all the benefits here. They try to gain environment, workers, poor people, and etc. But we tell you that this is inherently impossible, and that's not how they can win this debate. The economic harms placed on these families and on these vulnerable workers that our second argument was about is extremely long-term. That is to say, in order for the benefits of mitigating climate change to actually stand, companies will be forced to continuously not be able to work to their fullest extent, produce as much carbon as they want, and employ vulnerable workers and whatnot. In order for the impacts on government to actually be meaningful, then these these environmental regulations have to last a long time. But secondly, government claims that workers will be harmed on our world. Note that our biggest counterfactual is about adaptation, right? We were talking about narrowing in our efforts to helping the most vulnerable people. This is not properly responded to by DPM on why this is less effective than their world of simply mitigation. But further, we mentioned that other industries that are beneficial to the environment exist, right? That is to say that we argue that workers do not have to be displaced while new industries of renewable energy are able to emerge. This nuance was also ignored by proposition. Before moving on to our extension though, I also want to rebuild a bit on what my Ella already gave you. I think government heavily relies on mitigation for the rebuttals, right? DPM tries to push that their side is able to at least make like a little bit of change in the environment. So he says, although sure, it's like not that feasible, we're at least able to make a little bit of difference. But note that for the reasons we already told you, whatever mitigation is made will be marginal and mundane. So it's not worth the massive resources poured into the sector when other aspects, urgent aspects, also require more attention, and helping those aspects would actually be more feasible. The only way that DPM also tries to take down our argument about poor workers is again through mitigation by saying that they would at least be paid a little bit, that they'll be fine. This is inherently untrue because of the characterization my Elo gave you in the beginning of her speech. Companies are likely to cut off wages of and abuse workers if their total production ability is cut, because the richer owners of these companies have disproportionate power over their workers anyways. The power imbalance here cannot be ignored, and that is ignored by proposition side. We think that is tragic. Moving on to our extension then about why environment is worth trading off for economic benefit. Rachel already tells you why destroying the economy is detrimental for vulnerable people, but further, why is this harmful to the rest of society? Two reasons here and some impacts. Firstly, economic growth gives several benefits to society. The major one here obviously would be innovation. When companies have to struggle with a laundry list of carbon taxes and regulations and fines from the government, they have no incentive to continue innovating. Limiting the profit and capabilities of these corporations leads to a significant loss in efficiency and productivity. The traditional practices of these companies reduce operational costs and increase production speeds, enabling lower prices and greater accessibility to goods and services to actually occur. However, this limitation directly harms consumers, especially lower and like middle income households that benefit most from reduced costs. Essentially, the plan for government to protect the most vulnerable stakeholders only ends up backfiring. But the second benefit we give you is that the benefits of economic growth are actually feasible and are almost guaranteed. We would keep the status quo where governments have already pursued plans to improve the economy of countries, and we see pretty high success rates in these pursuits as well. Focus on economic growth is what has existed for decades, possibly centuries now, and we would want to continue the success that has so far been achieved. However, environmental reduction plans as large scale as what government envisions is not feasible, as my LO already proves why that's the case, and we wouldn't want to take as much of a risk, especially when there are other more important problems like the economy to be addressing. On the major impact here then, we'd say that there's major public dislike and backlash. Nobody likes these policies and regulations based on all socioeconomic classes. Poor workers lose their jobs and source of income. Rich entrepreneurs lose a lot of profit from their mega corporations and factories. Obviously, this makes it so much harder for governments to get anything done because everyone hates the regulations so much. In other words, these policies on affirmative are really just ineffective. Governments cannot make significant progress if this backlash exists. Whereas in our world, these policies are actually appealing to the public, where everyone thinks that they will be able to financially benefit and they see the merits of the policy quite clearly. In these cases, it becomes easier for governments to impose such policies. For all this oppose.
So first of all, as the proposition team, we've identified a few main interests of this debate and a few reasons why our case is better than the opposition. So first of all, under our case, we show that the environment is actually a very big asset, and that by helping these people in the environment, that we would benefit. And as also the first speaker of the opposition said, that these mitigation efforts sometimes do not need to cut costs. And so in the topic, even if it comes at cost of economic growth, in our best case, it won't come at a cost of economic growth. In our worst case, it will come at a cost of economic growth. However, we will accept this because, first of all, we have an obligation to the environment, and second of all, the long-term impacts and benefits that comes from the environment. We've seen that first of all, we have an ethical obligation to protect the environment, since we live off the land, and we have to protect the people that also rely on the environment, such as the vulnerable people that live in these remote communities that climate change hurts the most. And since we ruined it, we have the obligation to fix it up. We also have the obligation for the safety of our citizens. That for climate change, it causes a lot of disasters, and also slow creeping things such as air quality is declining, and so is water quality, as well as pollution. This can kill a lot of people, and it's shown in lots of polluted countries where cancer rates for lung cancer, asthma, and lots of other things related to this air pollution have gone up. This loss of life is very important, and as the government, we should be protecting this, as our citizens are the key role in our community. Additionally, these citizens, as the key role in our community, can help with the workforce, and so this new improving sector of this renewable energy for those citizens displaced by their work in the carbon intensive and fossil fuel burning industry can move to this sector, since it is largely the same business, which is supervising energy reserves and making sure this machinery is running. And also to address the opposition claim about how they benefit people in like the remote countries that work in these coal mines and that are the most vulnerable. We say that first of all, if we remove this element of coal mines, there'll be a lot of less danger for these people because they won't have to work these dangerous jobs. But also because of our investment into the environment, these third world countries that are usually impacted by droughts and fierce storms will not have to worry about that. So the infrastructure they built can be protected and will be safe, which means that these countries can focus on the employment in the new energy sector, and their infrastructure will not have to be rebuilt, so more people can attend school, and so they can get a better job and get into this new sector. Before I talk about the opposition's model, just a few miscellaneous things about how the environment is very important to humanity. And although it's good at doing these things, we do not pay attention to how complicated it is, and we cannot artificially recreate the processes that it uses such as biological control and the production of raw materials. So this is in the best interest of some of these industries, such as manufacturing, trade, energy, since energy is water intensive, hydration, and also decomposition and landfill. So, because of that, these industries are compromised from climate change, we see that the opposition's model of adaptation wouldn't work because even though it protects the most vulnerable people, everybody will be vulnerable in this stage if we don't protect against climate change. So it won't be feasible to protect everybody at the same time unless we invest in climate change. Thus, for all I've stated, I'm proud to propose.
We pay a high price for being intelligent, meaning to say that government side cannot win on the principle that it is so important to protect the environment and there are so many harmful things happening because we are not doing so. Proud to oppose. Straight on to clash one then, which side better protects workers? Firstly, if governments note that if governments have an obligation to their citizens, then the economy, if governments have the obligation to protect their citizens, then note that the economy is a much more important and direct issue that will affect them more. Why? Because governments cannot do all of the adaptation efforts. Because note here in this debate, Judge, that government side still must be able to do some form of adaptation because you cannot save the waters in Pacific islands like Fiji fast enough through methods such as mitigation, right? Meaning to say that they will still have to do some form of adaptation to keep up with climate change as they fight to find a solution and they waste a ton of money trying to do so. What does this mean? This means that as the economy goes down and they're still trying to waste the same amount of money, spend the same amount of money that we do on trying to help people, adapt to climate change. What happens is that the government runs significantly short of funds and all of the very idealistic programs to help individuals make sure that they can get new jobs, etc. What does this mean? The government is sort of stuck now, right? Because you have to help people adapt, but at the same time, they have to spend numerous amount of money trying to make sure that they can mitigate climate change, while also mitigating the impact of removing huge sectors of the industry, like the oil industry, has on the economy. What does this mean? This means that obviously workers will not be prioritized in a situation where you heavily prioritize climate change reduction to begin with. This means that what Nayoon says is true. It's that basically nobody will be willing to support climate change mitigation programs in the first place because it's literally affecting everyone. The people in Fiji cannot be saved from their drowning islands. The people who work in factories cannot be saved because the government doesn't have the money to provide for their programs for making sure that they get new jobs. And the rich will be angry because they have no more companies. This obviously, let's weigh the economy and the environment here then. You cannot solve economic problems without making sure that while heavily prioritizing the environment. This just leaves government in a state where they cannot do everything at once and they fail to do everything. Second clash then on which side makes a larger impact, more positive impact on the environment. Note a couple of things here. First, deputy mitigates most of their benefits and their policy because of the fact that they try to do everything at once, which I've already explained. Secondly, if every fine is temporary and nothing is long-term in the first place, meaning that when they try to mitigate the fact that the economic impact is very small, then what happens is that these companies will just bounce back after a while. There's no point in switching everything to EVs and sustainable resources when they can just wait it out for a few months and the government will be like, okay, we're done fining you, now we're just going to start our mitigation program. Which means that for government to for this debate to actually function and for government policy to even work, the effects on the economy have to be significantly long-term. What government's burden in this debate was to try to prove why that is worth it for the mitigation of climate change, which they have failed to do because of all this mitigating. Finally, again, everybody hates this policy, meaning to say that the effects of this policy are unlikely to occur on your side of the house simply because of the fact that there is so much opposition from literally everyone. Probably the current government won't be able to do anything for very long until the population votes them out. Finally, on adaptation, we help everyone better because government still must have adaptation on their side of the house. We have the funds because the economy isn't dying, and most importantly, we can prioritize the stability of the economy and actually ensure smaller mitigation efforts for climate change and more significant impacts for adaptation, which lead to a better society that is actually able to solve climate change, rather than the fact that rather than government side trying to do everything at the same time, ultimately failing. Proud to oppose.
Our stance was simple from the start. Mitigation does not have to be at the cost of the economy. Even if this is not true, adaptation is better to protect vulnerable workers than mitigation will ever feasibly be. And above all, protecting workers' right to a continuous flow of income is the most important value to protect in this debate. Happy to oppose. Why do we win on engagement? 3 specific reasons. 1, I think my Elo speech is enough to render the biggest push from prop to be irrelevant. That is to say, we give you 2 realistic examples of when mitigation of climate change is also beneficial to the economy, including renewable energy and EVs. Government does not prove their burden on why it is necessary to trade off the economy for the good of the environment, which is their only path to victory. 2, we engage with the biggest principle of dealing with climate change on 2 levels. Firstly, we tell you that adaptation is a better method of dealing with the damages caused by climate change because you're able to narrow in on the people you protect that are the most affected. And secondly, we tell you that protecting the economy is more influential to further the livelihoods of the average citizen, becoming more important than protecting the environment. No responses to either of our engagements by prop. 3, we engage with their biggest metric of weighing, which is reversibility. That is, we tell you that in order for their impacts on protecting the environment to stand, companies must be continuously prevented from furthering their economic paths. If a company goes bankrupt, the harms of that company are permanent. If an industry like mining or factory production is abolished, workers are permanently damaged because their skill sets are not applicable to other industries. No engagement on this point either. Then why do we win based off our unique substantives? Our biggest principle was protecting vulnerable workers. We tell you that there are ways to protect these people from climate change with other options like adaptation, but the only way to protect their livelihoods are to ensure a continuous stream of income. This is to say, government loses on the moral high ground on protecting vulnerable stakeholders. They unfairly push vulnerable individuals that can't necessarily use their skill sets in other sectors to lose their only sources of income. This principle was what we pushed to be the main metric of this debate, and government doesn't engage nor weigh. Finally, we told you about the large-scale public backlash against these policies. No one necessarily benefits from these environmental regulations because whatever benefits exist take a lot of time to be actually be tangible and noticed. This general disdain makes it unlikely for governments to be effective in implementing these policies, and thus the impacts on gov are generally hard to gain. Clear up ballot, proud to oppose.
I like to compare both roads in this case. So opposition's best road is how they have opposition's best road is where they have renewable energy, as they said, as a solution or something to help fight against climate change. So you don't have to use you don't have to use money in order to you don't have to find mining companies, etc., in order to make them the workers stay on or something. And not only that, but they also say how in their road they'll be able to have much more they will be able to have much more benefits, such as having being able to protect the vulnerable stakeholders more, I think, and also on how the economic growth of the country will remain stable. However, I'd just like to say that how our worst road is that these people will lose money. However, we somehow managed to mitigate the effects of climate change, and not only that, but we also do get less health problems related with it. So opposition doesn't really doesn't really respond to anything about how the environment is probably the most important thing. They try and explain how the economic growth is also irreversible. However, I like to say that economic growth is actually not. I would like to say that economic growth is, although it is possibly irreversible, speakers from above have been said, our third speaker, I think, has stated that these economic growth is not that irreversible, because you can always make new minings and more things afterwards, and minings and factories aren't even part of the major economical factor in our road. So even if we lose it, it wouldn't matter that much. We believe that environment is much more important because it affects health, and therefore I'm proud to affirm. Thank you.